right, let's get started, right? My clock says 8, which I think is 5. Please turn off your phones, I guess, is the announcement. This seems a little, my mic seems a little hot. Is it a little, should I back it up just a little bit? How's that? Is that okay? It's better, it was better before? Sorry, I'm like second guessing the audio guys. Well done. Okay. Hi, my name is Frank Lantz. Thank you for coming to my talk. The topic of this talk is the relationship between game theory and game design. So one thing that needs to be made clear up front is that the thing that we're talking about today when we say game theory is something very specific. Game theory is a well-established mathematical discipline that has applications across a number of fields in economics and biology, politics, military strategy, sociology, psychology, even philosophy. So people often mistakenly refer to any academic or analytical or theoretical games. People will say, oh, so you're teaching game theory. And it has to be explained that no, game theory is a specific thing that mathematicians and economists do. There's a whole department devoted to game theory, and their whiteboards look like this, and they help the craft, at least not in class. And likewise, I think most game designers don't really use game theory in their day-to-day practice at all. Proper game theory as a discipline of applied mathematics is just not that useful in most of the kind of day-to-day problems that professional game designers are wrestling with. So I don't think that Shigeru Miyamoto or Cliff Bleszinski or Peter Molyneux or Michael Breaux or Will Wright I want to admit up front that there isn't actually a lot of natural overlap between game theory and game design. However, looking past this initial distinction, I think there are some really useful and interesting connections between the two, and the purpose of this talk is to sketch those connections out. So here's how the talk is going to work. Mainly, I'm going to give you a broad sense of what game theory is, where it came from, and what I think is so interesting about it. And then I'm going to talk a little about what I think game theory has to offer to game designers, both from a practical perspective, but also as a source of inspiration and as kind of a new way to think about what we do. So I want to give one caveat, which is that this talk is given by an amateur enthusiast. Game theory is a serious academic field, and I am by no means an expert. I'm also not a mathematician, so while real game theory can get pretty hairy with some pretty dense equations, what I'm going to be going over today will remain firmly non-technical. So, what is game theory? Well, game theory is the mathematical analysis of situations where multiple parties are making choices, and the outcome of those choices is dependent on the choices made by the other parties. So these kinds of situations are often called strategic situations. The main idea here is that there are situations where I have to make a choice, and one of the main factors that I have to consider when choosing is what choice other people are going to make. So for example, let's say that I'm going to a Halloween party, and I'm thinking about what kind of costume I want to wear. And I want the most awesome costume, obviously. And one of the things that determines how awesome my costume is going to be is how many other people come dressed as the same thing. So I have to consider what choices other people are going to make when considering how awesome my costume is going to be. So it turns out that situations like this can be modeled mathematically, and doing so allows us to study them in a very precise way and see some patterns in them and learn some interesting things about those patterns. So in some cases, strategic situations like this can actually have solutions in the sense that if you really have clearly described the situation and you've ranked the outcomes in terms of the preferences for the different parties, and you actually know what they want and what they prefer to what, then you can actually figure out what choices they can make to get to the best outcome. So these are the situations that game theory studies, and this is what it's about. Game theory operates by creating abstract models of these types of situations that often look like this, where the parties are called players, and the actions that they're choosing between are called strategies, and the outcomes are called payoffs. So this whole thing is called a payoff matrix, and it turns out to be a pretty powerful way for creating mathematical models of these types of situations. Now, obviously, these models are abstractions, so you can't perfectly capture all of the subtle nuances of a real-world situation with discrete choices, and you can't ever perfectly reflect the true value of different outcomes with a single number, but you can use these stylized and abstracted models like diagrams that can highlight some of the important underlying dynamics of what's going on in real-world situations. So this is John von Neumann. He was one of the really one of the smartest and most prolific scientific minds of the 20th century. He was a mathematician who made important contributions both to pure mathematics and to physics, and he was also one of the pioneers of computer science. He was at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. He was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton with Einstein, and he also liked to party. John von Neumann liked to drink. He liked to tell jokes. He liked toys and games. And when he was a kid in Budapest, poker. And the main thing that interested von Neumann about poker was the way that it was different, both from pure gambling games like roulette and from games with no hidden information like chess. So with roulette, you can calculate your chances of winning. And with chess, you can, in theory, calculate the best move from any position, sort of regardless of what your opponent does, right? The game tree of chess is really like the game tree of tic-tac-toe, only larger. Right? There are correct moves that will lead us to the best outcome no matter how our opponent responds. So the game tree is just too large for us to find them, but we know they're in there. Poker is different. It's not just about calculating your odds of having the strongest hand and then choosing accordingly whether to bet or fold. It's about making the best choice given the choice that your opponent is going to make. And meanwhile, guess what? The choice your opponent is going to make is based on the choice you make. In poker, the players are always predicting what their opponents are going to do and predicting their opponents' predictions, and so on and so on. So this was the kind of game that von Neumann was interested in. In fact, here's a quote from von Neumann explaining game theory to a friend. He says, "Chess is not a game. Chess is a well-defined form of computation. But in theory, there must be a solution, a right procedure in any position. Now, real games are not like that at all. Real life is not like that. Real life consists of bluffing, of little tactics of deception, of asking yourself, what is the other man going to think I mean to do? And that is what games are about in my theory." So von Neumann wanted to know if games like this were just hopelessly chaotic psychological whirlpools of second and third guessing, or if they could be submitted to precise logical analysis. Would it be possible to develop a strategy for playing perfect poker in the same way that you could, with enough computing power, find the perfect strategy for playing chess? And if so, what would that strategy look like? In 1928, von Neumann published a paper called The Theory of Parlor Games, in which he proved the famous minimax theorem. And this was really the official origin point of the discipline of game theory. So let's begin by looking at a simple game as an example. So here's a classic game theory game called Cutting the Cake. So there are two players, the cutter and the chooser. The cutter gets to slice the cake into pieces, and then the chooser gets to gets first pick of the pieces. Let's also say that no matter how evenly you cut the cake, one piece is always just a little bit bigger than the other. Choice made by the other player. Now the chooser has a pretty easy choice. She's obviously going to pick this strategy. She's going to take the biggest piece. The cutter has to think a little bit harder. And the cutter would really like to get this payoff down here. But she's got to think about what the chooser is going to do. And thinking about that, she realizes that this whole right-hand column is pretty much eliminated. She's really got to look at this column over here and choose the strategy that's going to give her the best payoff here. Now, there's a term for a situation like this, like the situation that the chooser is in, where you can look at a see that there's another strategy that's available to you that does at least as good in every case and sometimes better. We say that strategy is dominated by the better one. And one of the ways to find solutions to game theory games is to simply just eliminate dominated strategies. And sometimes you can have very complicated payoff matrices with all sorts of strategies available. And when you start eliminating strategies for one player, you can then see that strategies that weren't previously dominated for the other player are now become dominated. And you can start to eliminate those, and then you can go back to the other player and start eliminating other strategies, and you can arrive at a solution that way. So that's called the iterative elimination of dominated strategies, and that's one way to get at solutions to complex games. Now, this process of having to look through your opponent's eyes to see the grid from their perspective and consider what they're going to do, and recursively to see how they see us, is really, this is the important and essential thing about game theory. It has this kind of strange, abstracted mathematical model of empathy built right into it from the ground up. So let's take a second to look at another key term used in game theory. So this is the idea of zero sum. A zero-sum game is one in which for every outcome, the payoffs the players have add up to zero. So whatever one player gains, the other loses. So you can think of most common two-player competitive games in these terms. I can only win if you lose. So we can assign values here to the outcomes of the cake-cutting game that turn it into a zero-sum game. And now you might say that in this case, hey, everybody's getting some cake. It's not really a zero-sum situation, and that's true. But the main point is that any increase in my payoffs is exactly matched by a corresponding decrease in your payoff. So technically, zero-sum is a special case of constant sum. But it's often used to describe any game where an increase in one player's payoff comes out of the pocket of the other player. So there are no outcomes that increase or decrease the overall combined payoff. So that's what we mean by zero-sum. Or row to leave them, and I can assume that you are going to pick the maximum payoff from the range that I leave you, and because what you get comes out of my pocket, I'm going to want to leave you the row or column with the smallest maximum payoff. So there's a word for this payoff. It's called the minimax. And in this game, the chooser leaves the cutter with the smallest maximum payoff, which is -1, and the cutter chooses the best piece she can realistically expect. These two strategies meet up at what's called a saddle point, both players' best realistic outcome given what the other player is going to do. And one of the things that von Neumann did to establish game theory as a legitimate domain of science was to prove that every two-player zero-sum game had a rational solution along these lines. So this is what's called the minimax theorem. So let's look at another simple game. This one's called matching pennies. Both players put down pennies on the table, and then they look to see if they're heads or tails. And if the two pennies match, then player 1 gets to keep them both. And if they're different, then player 2 gets to keep them. So now we can look at this payoff grid and see right away that there aren't any strategies that are in this game. But what we can do is expand the range of strategies by allowing players a strategy where they select randomly between heads and tails. Now we can see that each player has a way to minimize the other player's maximum payoff, which is by playing randomly. And oops, we're not done yet. And that's the talk. Thank you very much. Wow. So sorry about that. Okay, just take 1 second. Yeah. All right, here we go. So now we have a saddle point and a solution to the game, which is for both players to play randomly, in case you didn't know how to play this game. So strategies like this are called mixed strategies, as opposed to the pure strategies that we saw in cake cutting, where you do an action for sure 100% of the time. And so again, what the minimax theorem tells us is that every two-player zero-sum game has a rational solution either in the form of a mixed strategy or a pure strategy. So also, by the way, mixed strategies are not always 50-50. You can tweak the payoffs for matching pennies, for example, to look like this. So let's call this game Matching Pennies with Bill Gates. You win when the pennies match, and you lose when they're different. But there's a special rule, which is the payoff for matching on heads. If you match heads, then Bill Gates pays you $1 million. So you think, great, this is a game that I would love to play, and you play heads every time. You're like, I can't wait to get that $1 million. But if that's your strategy, then Bill Gates can play tails 100% of the time, and he's guaranteed to win a penny off of you every time you play this game. So the real value of this game is not the $1 million payoff, but it's the fact that Bill is basically forced to always play tails. So when you play tails, you're almost guaranteed to make a penny. Now, it's not $1 million, but it's not bad. And it actually turns good once in a while throw in a heads move to basically to keep Bill scared. To guarantee that he keeps playing tails all the time, right? And likewise, surprisingly, Bill should, once in a blue moon, throw in a heads play himself, which is really to keep you guessing and force you to play heads sometimes yourself, because every time you play heads, he makes a penny, and he likes that. So he's lowering your guaranteed win rate by once in a blue moon he plays heads. And so it turns out that the game theoretical solution to this game is actually for both players to play heads 1 out of approximately every 50 million games or something like that. That sounds like a fun game. Now, we see mixed strategies like this, for example, in baseball, when a baseball pitcher has a particular pitch that he's very strong at, like a fastball that he's really good at. And if he always throws his best pitch, then the batter knows what's coming and has an advantage, and therefore he mixes in other pitches that he's not as good at just to keep the batter guessing, which is a classic mixed strategy. So right out of the gate, game theory had a big impact. It situations that had previously been very murky. And von Neumann believed that the most useful application of game theory was in economics, and he partnered up with an economist named Oscar Morgenstern to write this book, A Theory of Games and Economic Behavior. And sure enough, it had a huge impact on the field of economics, providing a mathematical framework for analyzing a lot of the situations in economics where people or firms are making these kinds of simultaneous interrelated choices. What kind of product to make, what price to charge, whether to open up a new location, things like that. But another surprising area where game theory took hold was biology, where in some ways it has had the largest impact. And it has also been influential in philosophy. To really understand game theory's impact on these different fields, we need to expand our view beyond the types of games we've looked at so far. We need to look at non-zero-sum games, where there are some outcomes with larger or It's a game called Chicken. It's a simplified version of the game where two teenagers drive head-on towards each other, and your choice of strategies is to swerve at the last minute or not. So the payoff grid in Chicken reflects the idea that both players prefer winning to tying, and prefer tying to losing, and prefer losing to crashing, right? So if I don't swerve and you do, that's the best possible thing. I get +1, you get -1. And if we both swerve, then we both get 0. We both get nothing. If I swerve and you don't, then I look like a chicken and you look like a hot shot, and so I get -1, you get +1. But if neither one of us swerves, we both crash and die. So that's the worst possible outcome. So winning is good, losing is bad, but crashing is very, very bad. And as you see, the different outcomes for the two players don't add up to 0 in every cell of the payoff grid there. So one thing that reflects a dynamic of situations that happen all the time in nature, where animals have to decide how aggressive to be in fighting over a mate, or a good nest location, or the last piece of food. can help explain a lot of what's going on when animals are competing for limited resources. So in the 70s, this guy, John Maynard Smith, started applying game theory to biology and discovered that you can find tons of situations that are very much like chicken all over the place. How aggressive should I be when confronting a rival? How quickly should I back down? In biology, this game is usually referred to as hawks versus doves. And it turns out that you can see the solution to this game show up as a mixed strategy in the overall population of various species. Now, the solution emerges not from individual players calculating outcomes and consciously making a choice, but from the overall dynamics of selection and evolution. So, for example, let's imagine a population of a certain species in which everyone's a dove. So if everyone around you is a dove, then being a hawk is insanely valuable, right? It means that you're going to get the best of every conflict situation and never have to pay the crash penalty. So when a game, when you have a population like this, and then you introduce a gene for hawkishness just through random variation, the hawkishness gene will do extraordinarily well and will start to spread until eventually you get a lot of hawks in the population, and then all of a sudden it becomes better to be a dove, right? Once there are a lot of hawks that are confronting each other and then actually fighting and getting wounded and getting hurt in a lot of fights, naturally, what happens is a population can settle into a ratio of hawks and doves, which is called an evolutionary stable solution, or an evolutionary stable strategy for the game. So what's cool here is that the underlying math is consistent, whether we're talking about economists doing equations at a whiteboard or bighorn sheep or even microbes. Game theory has gone on to be incredibly important and influential within the study of evolutionary biology. Here's another cool thing about the game of chicken that I think is awesome. If you can limit your own options in a visible way, you can actually guarantee yourself a win. So let's say at the beginning of the game, you actually, let's say we're playing chicken. I take my steering wheel and I throw it out of the car, right? I just throw it out of the window of the car. Now, the other guy basically has to swerve at that point because it's like I'm guaranteed to win that game, right? And I think in other like chicken-style situations, if you can convince someone that you are truly irrational or otherwise impaired, or that you have so badly miscalculated the payoffs that you're like, you don't know what's going on and you're locked into a no-swerve strategy like a complete idiot, then you're going to win the game of chicken all the time against a fully rational player with all of his options open and a clear sense of the payoffs. Which is somewhat ironic, right? That removing options and impairing yourself might improve your results in a game. And we can see this happen sometimes in international relations, where some dictator will behave in a way that seems completely irrational and reckless, and you can't really know whether they are truly irrational or whether they've simply realized the extreme advantage that appearing irrational can give you in these types of situations. And so what would be the equivalent in nature? Well, how about an involuntary signal that demonstrates a loss of control, like blushing, right? The way that we blush when we're upset. So it's possible that what appears to be an involuntary, irrational emotion as a rational move in the chicken metagame. So that there might be this kind of second-order rationality or a kind of strange, deeper logic lurking under the surface of seemingly irrational behavior, that's a clue that there's something very weird and cool going on with game theory. Okay, so now here's the last example that we're going to look at. This is a famous and important non-zero-sum game, The Prisoner's Dilemma. It was invented by Merrill Flood in 1952. And it's called The Prisoner's Dilemma because the story that's attached to it goes like this. Two criminals are apprehended and put in separate cells. They're each given two options: confess and testify against the other guy, or remain silent. And we call those options defect which is betray your partner by confessing and testifying against him, or cooperate, don't incriminate your partner. So if he testifies against you, so he's being given the same option in his cell, right? And if he testifies against you and you remain silent, then you get stuck with the worst payoff, the sucker's payoff. You go to jail for 10 years. On the other hand, if you testify and the other guy remains silent, then you get the best outcome, right? You go scot-free and he goes to jail for 10 years. So if you both testify, then you'll get a lighter sentence, 3 years in jail. And if you both remain silent, then they won't have enough evidence to convict you of the main charge, but you'll be prosecuted on a lesser charge and get 1 year each. So, and that's the solution. Well, the key thing to realize here is that no matter what the other person does, it's always better for you to defect. If your partner defects, then you're much better off defecting. And definitely better off defecting, right? So if he's going to defect, then if you don't defect, you're going to get stuck with the worst possible payoff. So you better defect. And if he cooperates, so in either case, it's always better for you to defect. Now, I know my partner is being offered the same deal, and I think he's a rational guy, so I think he's probably going to defect. But actually, that totally doesn't matter at all. Because he could be completely irrational. He could be choosing randomly. It really doesn't matter what he does, because it's always, always better for me to defect. So let's say my partner and I are actually highly intelligent, rational individuals. Maybe maybe we know a thing or two about game theory and finding optimal solutions to these types of situations. So armed with this superior knowledge and rationality, we both defect, and we end up spending 3 years in jail. Meanwhile, let's imagine a couple of amateurs, a couple of clueless noobs who don't take advantage of game theory, and they know nothing about how to solve these types of situations. They don't have our superior intelligence and expert-level game-solving techniques, and they think to themselves, I don't know, I guess I'll just keep silent. I don't know, whatever. And they end up over here doing much, much better than us, right? And so that's why it's a dilemma, right? You get the sense of why it's a dilemma? And I want to impress on you that this is a genuine dilemma, right? It's not a trick. There's no easy way to weasel out of this. You can't say, oh, well, the value of honor is its own reward, or not snitching now will allow me to keep my reputation and I'll benefit from that later on, because all of those things can be captured in the payoff grid. Started. Right? The dilemma is real. Right? There's nothing misleading about saying we're always better off defecting. We truly are. Like the dummies who ended up over here, each one of them would be better off if she had defected. And yet, here we are in our so-called optimal solution, just hating life, rotting in prison, thanks to our suboptimal, irrational, or rather, thanks to our optimal solution, we're here. And meanwhile, these other guys are out living it up, roaming free and drinking and screwing and robbing other banks, I guess. So there's really no simple explanation for the prisoner's dilemma. There's no way to kind of sneak out of it. There's something deeply mysterious and cool happening here. And there's a lesson here, I think, about the limits of rationality. So in a way that's a little bit like how Gödel's incompleteness theorem offers a lesson about the limits of formal logical. The main places where game theory has a big impact was in the field of international relations, specifically the diplomatic and military impact of thermonuclear weapons. So remember, this is the 1950s, and the Cold War is a big deal. For a while, the U.S. is the only nuclear power, but it's clear that Russia is on its way to getting the bomb. And remember, U.S. and Russia aren't just distrustful of each other. They're straight-up enemies at this point. They're directly opposed to each other. There's a government-funded think tank called the RAND Corporation that's paid to think about these things. I love this image. I love the guy sitting on the chair that has no legs. It's like the military-industrial hipster complex in action. So these And Corporation is filled with smarty-pants mathematicians who are using this new science of game theory to model the situation between the U.S. and Russia. And once Russia gets the bomb, there are going to be some pretty big payoffs and some huge sucker payoffs to getting sneak attacked. And honestly, we don't know what payoffs the Russians and to a lot of people, it seems like maybe nuclear war is inevitable, and maybe the best possible outcome is to preemptively attack them now. That's what von Neumann thought. And von Neumann, who spent the final years of his life in a wheelchair, is probably the main inspiration for the character of Dr. Strangelove in Kubrick's film. But that's also what Bertrand Russell thought. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, who was an outspoken pacifist his entire life. But he was so convinced by the logic of game theory and this abstract description of the situation that he thought the best possible outcome would be for us to nuke Russia before Russia got nukes. And neither one of these guys particularly loved America, right? So it's not that they were driven by some strange, manic patriotism or something like that. They loved the world, and they wanted to save the world, and they genuinely thought the way to avoid a global war was to take out Russia before Russia got the bomb. Now, from our perspective, it seems pretty clear that these guys were wrong, and really wrong, like terribly, terribly wrong. And so maybe game theory was a bad thing, right? Maybe it almost pushed us over the brink of destroying the entire world. I think we have to honestly consider that. But I also want to consider another possibility, and many of you will have heard me make this point before in a previous talk, but I think it bears repeating, so stick with me, because the prisoner's dilemma, right, this wonderful demonstration of the limits of logic, the paradox of rationality, was also invented at Rand. And the techniques that game theory gave us for analyzing these situations also allowed us to consider other solutions than preemptive attack. And as disturbing and insane as the idea of mutually assured destruction sounds, maybe it was what we needed to see our way through this situation. And maybe if you invent atom bombs, you also need some kind of logic and language for thinking your way out of using them. And maybe game theory was that logic and that language that allowed us to think the unthinkable and think past that situation. And so far, we have managed to avoid blowing up the world. So I like to entertain the idea that there is some small chance that game theory, this idea extracted from a close study of poker, maybe saved the world. Maybe poker saved the world. And not in some kind of abstract, metaphorical way, but maybe a game that was invented as entertainment for degenerate gamblers literally saved the world. And, yes, and even if that's just a possibility, right? Even if it's just a small possibility, what does that tell us about what games are and what they can do? All right, so for me, one of the things that I find so amazing and cool about game theory is how paradoxical it is. How, on the one hand, it seems so sterile and artificial, assigning numerical quantities to outcomes and applying logic to determine your best choice. And on the other hand, it helps explain what's happening in these natural, organic ecosystems where animals are fighting and screwing and robbing each other. And example that one of the ways to resolve the paradox of the prisoner's dilemma is to think about it not as something that happens once, but as something that happens over and over and over again. So So in the harsh reality of Darwinian selection, ruled by survival of the fittest, how do we figure out how to get to that cooperative payoff? Right? How do these cooperative strategies even get a foothold in the world of the dog-eat-dog world of Darwinian evolution? So to answer this question, Axelrod organized tournaments of what's called the iterated prisoner's dilemma. So you get to submit a strategy in the form of an algorithm, a bot essentially, and your bot bumps into other bots and they play the prisoner's dilemma against each other a bunch of times, and then you bump into a different bot and you play against them a bunch of times. and sophisticated and clever bots to this tournament. But it turned out that the most successful bot was by far one created by the mathematician Anatole Rappaport called Tit for Tat. And what Tit for Tat did was incredibly simple. It always started out by cooperating, and then in every round, it did what the other guy did in the previous round. If you cooperated last round, Tit for Tat would cooperate. If you defected, Tit for Tat would defect. And lo and behold, Tit for Tat won the tournament. And then it continued to win in future tournaments. Even when other people knew that it was the bot to beat and tried to devise elaborate strategies to beat it, they were unable. So it was incredibly successful. And it turns out that, sure enough, you can find examples of tit for tat in animal behavior, in vervet monkeys, in tree swallows, in stickleback fish. And you can even see the same patterns in the behavior of soldiers in the trenches of the Western Front during World War I, where soldiers from opposing sides were in close proximity for long periods, and often a kind of bottom-up truce would evolve and be maintained for weeks or even months. So game theory can help us answer the question, how does altruistic behavior get a foothold in selfish environments? What are some of the primal, chemical, mathematical origins of morality and ethics? And this happened just recently, and it kind of blew my mind. Now, for years, we thought we knew everything there was to know about the iterated prisoner's dilemma. We thought that tit for tat was the thing that kind of solved it. And then just recently, these two guys, William Press and Freeman Dyson, discovered something new. They discovered that tit for tat is actually one example of a larger class of strategies that are called zero-determinant strategies. And zero-determinant strategies can actually set the partner's payoff to whatever they want. And they're called extortionate strategies because what you can do is take advantage of strategies that are evolving to get to the optimum payoff by having them evolve to have a strategy that actually gives you a larger share of the payoff than it gives them, right? So these zero-determinant strategies can take advantage of the kind of like naturally evolving, evolutionary stable solutions that are occurring in a dynamic environment. Bots are like climbing the hill in this kind of Darwinian evolution. These other strategies are taking advantage of that, exploiting it, and getting a larger share of the payoff. And it turns out that the only thing you can do I'm not going to let you exploit me like this, but you can only do that if you recognize that there's something behind that strategy, right? The only solution is to have a theory of mind, to recognize that you're up against one of these extortionate strategies, and it was designed by someone, and that by defecting, so that I get more, so that it's something that's more fair, right? Maybe it doesn't have to be 50-50, but it has to be, I'm not going to sit here and let you get so much more than me. And so this is kind of amazing, right? Because the idea that, not just the origin of altruism, is how sometimes chemicals that are good at making copies of themselves can start to slowly evolve into organisms, right, that reproduce, and then you get animals, and you get life. Right? You can almost see that the threshold to going from non-life to life. You can almost see the threshold of consciousness to sort of non-consciousness to consciousness in the case of things that are bumping into each other. And our situation, but only if we both recognize that we exist as a thing, And so it's kind of fantastic. And what's really happening here is that in this type of situation, the iterated prisoner's dilemma is actually becoming a different game. It's the ultimatum game, right? It's another type of game theory game in which you have two people, you give one of them $100, and you say, now you just divide it up between the two of you. And you can do it however you want. And then the second person just either gets to accept it or reject the whole thing, and nobody gets anything. right? So that's the ultimatum game. If you can recognize that you're in the ultimatum game, then you can escape from one of these extortion strategies. I find that mind-blowing and fascinating. Now, personally, I think that the most impressive thing about humans is what we accomplish in concert with one another. The individual humans are pretty amazing in their own right, but when you look at what we create through organized cooperation, it's just mind-blowing. You look at buildings and cities and airplanes and dance crazes and hospitals and slang and cathedrals and symphonies and video games. They're miracles. What we manage to do together through coordination is the miracle of humanity. Thomas Schelling is a Nobel Prize-winning economist who wrote about game theory and the strategy of conflict. And it was, in fact, a paper by Schelling that Kubrick read that inspired him to make Dr. Strangelove. And honestly, just about the best thing you can read of any of this stuff is Schelling. It's truly great. Most conflicts aren't just about competing, they're about bargaining, about negotiating, synchronizing our actions and choices to find mutual benefit. So Schelling uses the example of two paratroopers who are dropped into enemy territory, and they get separated, and they desperately need to find each other. And they each have this map. Where should they meet? So they need to look for a feature on the map that looks to me like it might look to you, like it might look to me like a good place to meet. So this is a game that can never be purely formalized. People with imagination and creativity will do better at this game and see features and patterns in the landscape that allow them to better synchronize their guesses with other players. And Schelling's point is that players in game theoretical situations are often faced with a similar challenge. We might be in a game with multiple solutions, multiple saddle points, multiple places for us to meet at a mutually beneficial payoff. In the explicit descriptions of the game, in the rules of the game. So this too can require creativity and imagination. So again, we're led to the limits of logic and reason. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that we didn't get here by rejecting the very ideas of models and quantification and rationality. We got here by trying to express as much as we could with our models and quantifications, and then realizing that there's always something more. So now that we know what game theory is, and we've talked about what's cool and fascinating about it, what are some specific applications to game design? Well, to begin with, I want to point out, again, the idea that this important and influential scientific discipline emerged from the study of real-world games, entertainment games, the kind that we design. To be a powerful window into math and science. The first book on probability was Christopher Huygens on reasoning in games of chance. Long before the first computers, we had games like chess to show us what computation looked like. It's said that Charles Babbage was inspired to design the difference engine after he played chess against the Mechanical Turk. The development of information theory by Claude Shannon and his colleagues at Bell Labs was deeply influenced by an interest both in games like chess, but also in the mathematics of gambling games. One of the key figures of game theory, John Nash, who developed the idea of the Nash equilibrium, designed a beautifully elegant board game about networks while he was a grad student at Princeton. This game was also independently designed by a Scandinavian mathematician and philosopher, Piet Hein. So I want to remind us of this proud tradition and celebrate it. Now that we are professionals who make games as commercial products, let's not forget the brilliant amateurs, the tinkerers who designed games and puzzles as ways of exploring ideas and investigating the intersections between math and logic and philosophy. People like Nash and Hein, John Conway and Lewis Carroll. Secondly, I want to point to the areas of game design where an understanding of game theory has direct relevance for a formal understanding of the games that we're working on. So in multiplayer competitive games, for instance, where issues of dominated strategies are actually often a key aspect of game balance and game tuning. So we talk about one weapon, talking about dominance in the classic game theoretical sense. If you listen to high-level players talk about what's going on in a serious competitive game, like an RTS or an FPS or yourself in your opponent's shoes. what's often called yomi, the recursive second and third level thinking that is the hallmark of game theoretical analysis. And you'll also hear them talk in terms of being greedy and punishing greedy play. To really understand what's going on in these games, it pays to be aware of how shelling is in them, right? So a game like EVE Online or Team Fortress 2 Gabe Newell is a pretty smart guy. Yanis Varoufakis is the economist he hired to work at Valve, and this is one of his books. He wrote a big book on game theory. Thirdly, I want to suggest that game theory is a rich source of inspiration for game designers. Even though most of the games used in game theory are Gedankenspiels, they're thought experiments that aren't really playable, but are meant to illustrate a concept, many places where we find things that are simple but not trivial. And I think we should be constantly searching for places where there's a tight bundle of forces pulling us in different directions. That's where you're going to find the densest and kind of thorniest decision problems, where solutions on one level open up to be problems at a higher level. And there are lots of actual games that they're either from a deeper exploration of game theory style dilemmas and coordination problems. Almost everything I've done on Facebook has been influenced in some way by these ideas. The Friend game was almost a pure example of coordination problem gameplay, and about how we bootstrap social truth out of the back and forth of reciprocal guessing. Spore Islands was 100% about finding robust strategies and evolving ecosystems. Power Planets about the issue of altruism and greed. And even Parking Wars had a kind of chicken game built into the scoring system. The payoff is always growing exponentially for both the parker and the ticketer, and you want to wait as long as possible before pushing the button, but you also want to be the first person to push the button, so when should you push it? I think that game theory is a great source of thinking about new directions for hard but tractable group decision problems. It could lead to really interesting social gameplay. I have one graduate student at NYU who has a background in game theory, actually, and is planning to explore a Tragedy of the Commons style group resource management dilemmas as his game design thesis. So I'm really excited to see how that develops. And finally, I want to talk the relationship between different aspects of game design that are sometimes seen as opposed to each other. So game designers are becoming increasingly interested in exploring a richer set of human relationships and a wider variety of human emotions. And often these are ambitions that are seen as alternatives to the traditional game-like structures of goals and points, of competition and winning and losing. Analysis of what's going on, you're trying to optimize the solution, as opposed to play that's more expressive and creative and imaginative. But I think that game theory gives us a totally different way of thinking about this issue. Game theory illuminates the way that math and logic and reason are deeply entangled with instinct and emotion and relationships. So if there's one thought I would like you to walk away with today, it's this: the rational is not incompatible with the sublime. I mean, it can seem like it is, because the rational operates by taking. I think that game theory itself, as successful as it has been, has kind of a bad rep. It looks at human relationships and human values, things like honor, and trust, and honesty, and betrayal, and it abstracts them. It takes them apart and it models the mechanics that are underneath them. And this is kind of repulsive in a way, right? I mean, I feel it too. To even acknowledge that there might be mechanics underlying love, underlying faith and pride and kindness, shame, it's disturbing. We recoil at this idea. And we want to say, no, don't even go there. Don't even look. But I kind of want to say, go ahead, look. These things will not break. Explanations do not exhaust a topic. Knowing that the person that you love is made of atoms doesn't diminish your love. It doesn't even begin to exhaust the things you can say about this person and your relation. But knowing that sex and love are enmeshed in coordination problems and the arithmetic of survival and reproduction is, I admit, somehow a little more unsettling. Humans are made out of atoms and are subject to the laws of physics. Humans are also animals, sculpted by evolution. We are a certain type of animals. We're calculators. We occupy the cognitive niche. And we're social. Most of our cognitive problem solving happens in ways that are tangled up with each other. This fact can begin to give us a new insight into human relationships, into social behavior, into psychology, emotions, even into the origins of consciousness. But it doesn't even begin to exhaust the topic, our understanding of what it is to be human, or to diminish the deep mysteries of what it means to be human. So remember, game theory isn't just about rationality. It leads us directly to the limits of rationality, to the places rationality can't go. But it does this not by turning away, not by saying we dare not go there, but by following rationality all the way through to the other side. In 1959, C.P. Snow identified the two cultures problem. The humanities and the sciences had become totally different domains that didn't really speak to each other. And he raised the question, can we admire and respect them both? Can we bring them together, study them both that can be brought together? Can you see the mathematics within honor, love, faith, reputation, shame, trust, and not diminish them, not be afraid that they will unravel? In the same way that you can look at the person that you love and know that they're made up of atoms, and know that your feelings for them are made up of atoms, and know that that doesn't change how you feel about them, and knowing that this knowledge is deeper and more steadfast than any other type of knowledge. I think if you're really interested in social interaction and human emotion and how to model these things with interactive systems, then I think you should be interested in math and poker and strategy, rules and points, and yes, games, because it's rules and logic all the way down. But it's also story. I think we have some time for a couple questions, if anyone has a question.
Yeah. Whoa, Jesus. And taking the people are made of atoms analogy further, there's that famous XKCD, about the sociologist and then the psychologist looking to the right and going, more formal, and then, biologist, chemist, physicist, and then way off to the right is a mathematician. It's like, I didn't see you guys mechanics, and it's kind of usefulness in day-to-day stuff. And so, like, if to take your analogy, if game theory and that kind of like intense, beautiful and amazing theory, and it's predictive and all of the things you want out of a theory, but it also doesn't teach you how to juggle or whatever you're trying to do. I don't think it's all that useful, but we're not really looking for utility, right? I mean, we're looking for truth. That's my take on it. Like, I don't think it's necessarily useful in some applied auction for the FCC. But I don't think that it's useful. I don't, apply it in my life. What I think that's useful about it is seeing into how the world works, like what the world is, what it's made up of, and I think that that's maybe of dubious use sometimes, right? It doesn't help you cross the street and get groceries. Right? I mean, is that a good answer? That it's not necessarily that useful, but that doesn't stop it from being true and therefore interesting and worth. No, it was an awesome talk. I got to figure out what I'm going to have you talk about next year.
All right. Thanks. Yes. Should we go over there? Is there a question? Yeah.
Yeah, so if you have a game and you're doing it, a real-world game, and then you have a theoretical game that might have multiple equilibrium points, which maybe you're calling them an outcome. With multiple equilibriums, how are you supposed to decide which one will be the outcome in the real-world game that you're playing? If this equilibrium is supposed to correspond to the real outcome?
That's the beauty of what Schelling talked about. There are tons of situations like that, where there isn't a single Nash, what's called Nash equilibrium, right? A place where we're all happy with the outcome given what everyone else chosen. It's kind of, we're all snapped into place because no one can change their strategy and do better given the strategy that everyone else has picked, right? That's great when there's only one of those in a game, and then you can say, well, that's probably going to happen. Players will discover that point and snap into it. But what's interesting is when there are multiple points that are like that. And then you don't know. Right? But this is, again, it's not about predicting what players are going to do. It's about having a kind of conceptual model which helps you understand what's happening under the hood. And then you run the game and you watch what players actually do.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yes. Oh, over here. Yes.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
So I recently read an amazing article by Joe Henrich out of UCLA. And he had gone around the world and taken game theory, specifically the ultimatum theory.
The ultimatum game, yeah.
The ultimatum game, and had applied it to all of these different cultures, and the expectations that we had come to expect after years of studying it were completely turned on their head in what people considered to be fair and these kind of things applied to culture. And so I guess, especially when it comes to game design and game theory, studying this stuff, so is it fair to assume that the world is significantly westernized, that, especially with game design, that it's still fair to study old traditional models of game theory?
Yeah, well, so game theory doesn't make any predictions about how the old when we do this, right? And what happens is different if you run it in Chicago and if you run it in Zimbabwe, that you get different outcomes. And then I think what game theory is useful is at helping you understand like the underlying dynamics of the norms and the ethics that we evolve. Ethics as coming from somewhere, right? We like to think of them as being handed down transcendently and being a kind of universal truth that we get to glimpse like from a Platonic realm or something. But the idea that disturbing thought. But I think that you're going to end up with different norms and different ethics based on all kinds of different starting conditions and different details of the culture and the community that you're in.
Cool. Thank you.
Let's go back to
so I have first a very simple factual question.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with The Trap?
No, I don't think I have seen that.
Well, that's great. I love that answer because it's hard to see here. You can see it on Google Video, but it uses a bunch of copyrighted stuff, and so they can't show it in the U.S. But he essentially goes through exactly what you've talked about, except he looks at the whole thing through the lens of political structure and how political strategies have been shaped by game theory, and he goes up against the limits of political strategies, and exactly what you've done in the realms of sort of more gamey, the way that we think of games.
Yeah. All that shows why Romney and Obama are actually really, really close together in the center in terms of their political platforms.
Anyway, so Adam Curtis, The Trap, it's really good. But in my own investigations, whatever, I have reached the same conclusions as you and Adam Curtis, but putting everything through a sort of a social filter, specifically looking at the way that these things developed, because in the 50s, in addition to getting sort of these big political moves and the Cold War and so forth, there's also a lot of social change that leads to a lot of this sort of like, oh, maybe instead of some people are winners and losers, maybe these people, specifically women and people of color, like maybe those people like accepting larger groups, player bases, leads to this sort of thing.
My hope is that games can help improve the way that we see how these systems are designed, how they operate, and express ideas and discover patterns and kind of underlying dynamics that give us greater insight into those kinds of political situations. And I think that's all the time we have. So thank you very much. And on to your next thing. Yay.